It's time to set the record straight.
You have 4 unheard messages. Message 1.
Hey Jay, how you doing? I hope you're doing good over the summer. You know, it's been a minute. I noticed you haven't been texting or calling a lot, and I'm starting to get a bit worried, but not too worried. I'm sure you're out there doing your stuff. I'm probably just a bit paranoid. You know, just hit me back or whatever. You're probably doing fine, but you never know with you little snake. Anyways, you know, just hit me back, you know. See ya.
Message 2.
Jay, where have you been? You know, I'm starting to get a bit worried. You still haven't texted and called me. It's the summer. I'm sure you're free now. I want you to call me or text me, you know, anything like that. I can take you out to like Cooters or something like that. I don't know. Please, you know, just hit me back. I just at least want to make sure you get, at least give me a hi or something like that. Anyways, hit me back.
Message 3.
Jay, where have you been? You still haven't texted or called me at all. I should send you a link to my Life 360 so I can make sure where the hell you're at. Cause it's not a joke anymore. You're making me think you're making me think you're dead. And I don't want to think that, please. Send a period, a semicolon, something. Call me, just breathe. I need to hear at least 1 second of your breath to make sure you're okay, please.
Message 4.
This is not a joke anymore.
Sir Kakko, Sir Kakko, Sir Kakko. He should be grateful for my lack of correspondence over the last 3 months. Why such intense statements, though? I suppose I failed to consider how significant this whole ordeal would be to his feeble brainwaves. Well, let us consider the bright side. New year, new roommate, new courses. Oh, there is so much to look forward to. Right, Moxie? Moxie? Where are...
Ow!
Oh, crud! I forgot to place him on my desk!
Could you not remember to sit me down?
Why, I apologize, sir, but starting another year is... Moxie, what the hell was that voice?
I'm, let's just say, distancing myself from the show. And please, call me Mux now.
Mux. M-U-X. Oh, like the shorthand term for a multiplexer.
Well, sure. We can call it that.
Well, Mux, allow me to ask for your opinion. Do you believe that Sir Kakko would care if I decided to emulate classic arcade games?
I don't think he cares.
I would sure hope so. My desire to experience the wonders of Moto San Bosconian is too strong to contain. Almost strong enough to make a video about. As a matter of fact, that's a wonderful idea! Salutations, Homo sapiens. If you're like me, a slightly less disgruntled college sophomore who is trying his best to make the rounds, then you may be all too familiar with the video game. Video is, of course, a digital signal that is displayed on some form of hardware, whether analog or digital, and a game is a form of competition that has a set of guidelines attached. Put those two together and voila, you have a video game. I don't play them particularly often, the busy gentleman I am must prioritize his time, but I would be astonished if a single viewer has never touched one. Today's video games come in the form of PC gaming and console gaming, but let us regress to the 1970s and 1980s, when the ultimate place to play video games was the arcade. We're not on about Dave & Buster's either, no. We're going back to the classic arcades, the cabinets and cocktails that could bring endless joy for a measly 25 cents. No, the fact that I do not like retrofuturism is not relevant. This time period is far behind us now. Excitement over a new cabinet coming to your local arcade? I certainly was not around for those days, but let us just imagine for a moment. First of all, an arcade game is a machine that tends to be installed in some business location. Back then, they operated almost exclusively on coins, hence the alternative title of coin-operated game. Countless developers from various sectors of the globe would have their hand at making the game that would eat the most circular metal in the building, from your Atari to your Midway to your Gottlieb, but the most prominent companies were based in none other than Japan. Taito, Japanese. Nintendo, Japanese. Sega, Japanese. So on, so forth. All of these companies have released fantastic games over the years. Taito had an especially major influence with its most early releases, but I believe there's one company of the time that dominated the rest. In my humble opinion, the greatest arcade developers of all time, the ones with the most significant influence and arguably the greatest games, well, it's pretty obviously Namco. This will be no history lesson, but we'll go ahead and introduce the core structure of Namco. A sir by the name of Masai Shinya Nakamura, who is unfortunately not with us anymore, founded a company on June 1st, 1955, freshly 70 years ago. The company was recognized for a while as the Nakamura Manufacturing Company, and its first products were rocking horses. Yeah, most video game companies started with simple origins. Nintendo had carts, Nakamura had rocking horses, and it was even the company's first logo. The children of Japan were quite pleased. Sir Nakamura made some yen, everyone wins. Nothing too spectacular happened during this time period, but in the late 1960s, this company would begin to dabble in the world of electromechanical arcade games. The Periscope would be the first arcade project from them, originally from 1965, though it would be reissued the following year by Sega. Of course, it all comes full circle. Nakamura Manufacturing Company would then have its name abbreviated to, what else? Namco. This change colloquially happened in 1971, but wasn't made official until 1977. Not helping is that, for the entirety of the 1980s and some of the 1990s, they threw on an extra T to the end of console games, making it Namcot. The reasoning for this is a little shaky in my research, but I landed on the answer that the T stood for tomorrow, and this was a subsidiary of the main Namco company before said main company would release the games themselves. However, the home console side of Namco has nothing to do with this particular video. The most notable product to come out of the pre-independent arcade era would be F1, a racing game where real plastic cars were projected and used to represent the player's controls, even complete with a custom explosion cell that the game swaps to. As outdated as this technology seems, I cannot help but find this seriously impressive, especially for 1976. It's the type of innovation that is relatively uncommon nowadays. It was developed by Namco, but was released in the United States by Atari. We'll see this a lot, by the way. Namco would always license their earlier games to companies based in the US when the games got here, and pretty much all of the credits to Namco would be removed. The reverse is also true though, as Namco would distribute a selection of Atari titles to Japan. All of this is merely context to the video's actual subject, as it's about time we hone in on the arcade games themselves. In October of 1978, Namco would bring out its very first independent, designed in-house arcade game, GB.
GB? More like GD.
I am not falling for that, Mooks. I was not born yesterday.
D's not. Sorry.
Ahem. It's certainly not the first game you expected me to name, is it? Well, it is Namco's very first official independent arcade game. So be it. Now, GB is not a game I would consider a classic, but its existence is basically why we have the actual classics. Looks a lot like Breakout, doesn't it? That's no coincidence. Of the Atari games which Namco brought to Japan, the 1976 game Breakout was one of them. The designer of this game was a sir named Toru Iwatani, arguably the second most important figure to Namco other than Sir Nakamura himself, and he wished to take on a pinball game. So, combine Breakout and Pinball, and this is the result. It's fairly simple, but somewhat charming in its own way, right? You bounce the ball around with your two paddles and try to score as many points as possible. It did warrant two sequels, Bombi and QTQ, both from the following year. They each made improvements to the gameplay, and the latter sequel is thus an especially enjoyable game as the third of the trilogy. However, none of these three were particularly successful, due to the dominance of Taito's 1978 classic Space Invaders. This was the most significant arcade game of all time before a certain yellow creature would defeat it. So before releasing QTQ, Namco would take on the Titans at Taito directly with what many recognize as the first classic in their lineup. On September 15th, 1979, a cabinet known as Galaxian hit the scene. I'll admit, I think this game is lackluster, but it's certainly an improvement to the groundwork that Space Invaders laid out. This is, arguably, where the true Namco came about. This game was a major success both in its home and in the US, with it coming second fiddle to the aforementioned Space Invaders in Japan, and Atari's Asteroids here in the West. It's your standard space shooter gameplay-wise, though in my opinion, it's unnecessarily difficult. Skipping the admittedly very bland SOS, the second Namco game to be a hit would be Rally X in January of 1980, a maze game in which you control a blue car and collect all of the flags scattered across the track while avoiding rocks and the opposing team of red cars. Notably, this is the introduction of background music in a Namco game, and the semi-iconic challenging stage, which is essentially a place to stack up on points, being your third round, which would become a Namco staple for the next few years. It's written as challenging instead of challenging in this game though, due to Japanese alliteration. Rally X was not all that major here, but back at home, it was a huge success. In fact, a lot of Namco's output would be significantly important in Japan, but only do decently well in the West. These games truly deserved more appreciation from us, especially the underrated gems which I'll discuss later on. I'm a huge fan of Rally X, but its upgrade, New Rally X from the following year, is undoubtedly leagues better, both in gameplay and that theme music. We'll stick to chronological order, but we'll skip some of the really irrelevant games. Unfortunately, nobody will be looking out for something like Navarone, which, this is kind of 1980s shovelware. Our sights are on Sir Iwatani's most profound creation of his life, and the most successful arcade game to ever be released. I'd be doing it an injustice if I explained it, so the game shall explain itself. There's really not much I can add to this one, is there? I'll try to list some factoids that you may not know, but there's the chance that you know all of these already. If so, you are quite astute, and you should consider being my friend.
Desperation much, huh?
Well, you have to start somewhere, don't you?
Honestly, fair enough. At least you're trying.
Is that a backhanded compliment?
It's not on the back of my hand, is it?
So, factoids. Pac-Man was released in Japan for testing on the date of May 22nd, 1980, meaning its 45th anniversary has passed during my time off. Each of the 4 ghosts has a unique set of instructions for movement based on Pac-Man's location. The Japanese names are hardly recognizable by today's standards, so we'll stick to the English ones. Blinky chases Pac-Man straight ahead by simply going the fastest route to your current region. Pinky targets the region a few units in front of the direction Pac-Man is facing in an effort to cut off your movement. Inky targets a region opposite to the distance of Blinky to Pac-Man in order to get you stuck, and Cly chases you until he gets close enough, then retreats to his scatter corner. There's an entire video detailing just this, by the way. The original Japanese artwork, despite it being iconic and the basis of Pac's current design, was not good enough for the Midway team that distributed the game here, so this monstrosity took its place. I will never understand this interpretation, and the fact that most people experience this is not ideal. Yes, by the way, the late Bally Midway distributed this game, as they have done with most of the games beginning with Galaxian, and all mentions of Namco are removed. The famous level 256 kill screen is actually level 0, contrary to popular belief, and another entire video has been made on that. Lastly, most of the Pac-Man sequels were made by Midway and not Namco, including the all-too recognizable Miss Pac-Man. In fact, the copyright for this character has been thrown around over the years, and now Namco can't even legally use her anymore. Isn't that something? The first legitimate Namco-made Pac-Man sequel was Super Pac-Man in 1982, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. That's enough Pac for now. The year before, in 1981, the sequel to Galaxian was released, known as Galaga. This was infinitely better, and there's no question to that. It quickly became the second of Namco's big 3 games, and for good reason. It's still a thrilling experience even today. Simple, yes, but it makes Galaxian and Space Invaders seem like dog shit in comparison. The true beauty of Galaga can only be realized through your own playthrough, however. The third game, 1984's Gapless, was another improved version, yet it didn't get nearly as much hype despite it being an objectively more dynamic experience. The third of Namco's big 3 would be released on February 20th, 1982, known as Dig Dug. Yes, this is the game that started the inflation fetishes of today. You play as Taizo Hori, and your goal is to eliminate all of the tomatoes and dragons by either dropping rocks to their heads or, yes, pumping them up to the point of explosion. It's disgusting, sure, but the game is still addicting. It's no wonder this game took off the way it did, especially when considering the trends of today. A sequel was made in 1985, simply titled Dig Dug 2, but it was considered a failure. Unfortunate because this is an underrated gem for me, but the next chapter will be all about those. The last games that I would consider universal classics from the perspective of the world would be Xevious from 1982 and Mappy from 1983. Both games were relatively unpopular in the United States, but were huge hits in Japan once again, going back to the common theme. Xevious would be the pioneer of the double shooting genre, being one of the first games in which you have to fight both air targets and ground targets at once, and while this game is really tough, I enjoy every moment I play. Meanwhile, in Mappy, you control the titular mouse, and you have to collect all of the various pieces which have been stolen by Namco and his minions, the Mukis. Namco, because meowing in Japanese is nyan. Mappy cannot jump, so he uses trampolines, and he also cannot attack, so he has to use the various doors to either slam in the enemy's face or throw a magical beam to blast them away. Mappy was a culturally significant game in Japan over the 1980s, getting an arcade sequel in 1986 and multiple home console sequels. It's sad that the same cannot be said for our region, but you can't have it all, can you? Namco would continue to produce countless arcade games each year, all the way up until the turn of the millennium, but I do consider this the end of the games that everyone recognizes. Mind you, the games I have discussed in this section are not the greatest games in my opinion. They're simply the ones that are considered classics to most. When it comes to the best games, most of the time, they're the ones that are glossed over. Unless you're me. What better way to kick off this section than with the Pac-Man sequels? This may be controversial, but I would, in fact, rather play these than the original game. The Midway sequels do not count for the record. This is strictly regarding the Namco sequels. Super Pac-Man is actually a much easier game, as the addition of the Super Pellet makes blazing through each stage very thrilling, yet still challenging since the duration of the pellet is limited more and more each round. Also helping are the pretty catchy sound bits and the intermissions, which are my favorite out of all of the games. For being the first true sequel, I say they did it justice. Pac and Pal, the Japan exclusive sequel, took the same gameplay and upgraded it by decreasing the amount of collectibles, bringing in Miru, who is helpful for your progress but detrimental to your point counter, and replacing the pellets with special items that stun ghosts in unique ways. These two games are similar in how they generally function, but I do think Pac and Pal perfected the unlock and collect style that the former game introduced. 1984's Pac-Land would be next, with it being one of the inspirations to the console release of Super Mario Bros., arguably the most successful console game in history. This game was also loosely based on the 1982 cartoon produced by Hanna-Barbera. This was made more apparent for the localization, in which the sprites were altered to resemble the cartoon even more. Also, they made Pac-Man way faster for some reason. I don't know what the deal with that is. The final sequel in the core anthology would be Pac-Mania in 1987, where the game takes place on a three-dimensional appearance, and Pac-Man can jump. He can f***ing jump now, and so can some of the ghosts.
That genuinely seagulls.
Moving on from the yellow thing though, my favorite game from early Namco has to be Bosconian from 1981. This game runs on the same hardware as Galaga, but a much more intricate game. You operate in an open playfield, can move in 8 directions, and your mission is to eliminate all of these green bases while avoiding the various other enemies and space junk surrounding you. A very simple game to pick up and play, and an absolute beast for point grinding. Arcade games are defined by having no end 90% of the time, making the goal to have your point total being displayed on top. Bosconian's stages being full of objects to shoot and having enemies spawn in consistently makes it the perfect game for point farming, and if one Homo sapien is skilled enough, he or she may use the first round to earn a 20,000 point bonus life. This may just be my favorite Namco game of all time for its gameplay and versatility, and yet not a single soul appreciates it. If I were to master any single game, it would have to be this one. My second favorite game from Namco would have to be one even less recognized than Bosconian, 1985's Modos. Remember Rock'em Sock'em Robots? This is like an abstract arcade version of that game. Your goal is literally just to knock out all of the various hazards on the playing field before they either off you themselves or you fall into a hole created by shooting stars which appear if you play for too long. The playing field will hand you upgrades, those being power pills to increase your knockback knockback, and these wings which allow you to jump. Knocking off enemies here is genuinely so satisfying, and their mass increases from stage to stage, making for a perfect difficulty ramp. This also means that the player must make very clever use of the collected upgrades, so as to not waste them when not needed. While there's not necessarily a point farming incentive, it's still a thrilling game all the same, and arguably has the greatest soundtrack in the Namco lineup. Genuinely, listen to this. How about Metrocross, also from 1985, where you must traverse through a course, jump hurdles, kick soda cans, launch from ramps, and ride skateboards before the timer runs out. This one is really a thrill, and even has incentive to finish as quickly as possible, as your remaining time from each of your last 3 rounds is appended to your timer for every 4th round. Miss the mark once, and it's game over. As per usual, it also has a killer backing theme. A vast majority of Namco's output, especially past 1987, was Japan exclusive. This was beyond the peak of their influence, but not at all beyond the end of the greatest games. From 1988's March and Maze and Phelios to 1989's Rompers and Blastoff, the latter of which is actually a really great sequel to Bosconian, Namco still had some wonderful games to satisfy your quarters. Though, this is Japan now, so I should really say 100 yen coins, but you understand. I should also probably point out Splatterhouse, a game which would go on to spawn an entire series of console sequels after the 1988 arcade original. I'm not terribly familiar with this one, but it seems like it deserves the hype. Namco also dominated the racing genre early on, with Pole Position in 1982 and its 1983 sequel, both licensed to Atari over here. This game would be the reigning champion of arcade racing until Sega came charging in with their Hang On series in 1985, only for Namco to snap back with Final Lap and Winning Run. Clearly, if you dare to compete with Namco, they were prepared to reclaim the throne. Namco's arcade output is so revolutionary that it warrants an entire Wikipedia page just for it, which isn't exclusive to Namco, but I'd argue that the Namco page is much more elaborate than any of the others. The details included here are fantastic, and I recommend that you read the page for yourself using the link below or this collection of squares. Even though the original Namco is no longer a company, having been merged with Bandai in 2005 and folded into the modern Bandai Namco the following year, the Namco name and logo are both utilized today for the various compilations that come out every now and then. That's right, I'm referring to the Namco Museum series. By 1995, Namco had already put together a beautiful catalog of arcade hits, and with Sony's PlayStation about to hit the worldwide market after its Japanese debut, the time was right to put out a compilation. Or how about an entire anthology? On November 22nd, 1995, the very first volume for Namco Museum was released in Japan, containing 7 selections from the arcade library. These were also not emulations, they were full remakes on the PlayStation's hardware. This would be the first of a total 6 volumes, with the total game count being 30 worldwide and 38 in Japan, as the 6th volume, Encore, was only released there. This initial lineup was packed full of bonus content, from concept arts to history and documents to even having the collection itself take the form of an interactive museum, with unique rooms for each title. Namco truly went above and beyond for this anthology, and it's a level of effort that was unfortunately never replicated for future entries. The PlayStation received this collection, while the competing Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast received a much more condensed version, with only 6 of the most relevant games out of the original 38. Needless to say, what a downgrade. Namco would continue to release a different compilation for each console generation, with different game selections occupying each, but none had the full experience which the original collection did. The most notable entries are Battle Collection for the PSP, which includes 4 brand new arrangement games that function as modern sequels, Namco Museum Remix and Megamix for the Nintendo Wii, which include brand new games based on Namco's brands featuring a limbless Pac-Man, and Virtual Arcade for the Xbox 360 for being the largest single collection to date. This absolute behemoth of a collection contains 34 games total, 3 of these being modern interpretations. It's lacking in every category other than the game count, but it's still probably the most valuable of the series outside of the original anthology. Funnily enough, while the Wii and 360 would each receive pretty solid releases, the PlayStation 3 would instead get Namco Museum Essentials, with a measly 5 arcade games and 1 original title. 6 games, you know, the same amount as the Nintendo 64. How ironic that the platform which started the series would get the most bare bones collection of the bunch. The most recent installment would technically be Namco Museum Archives in 2020, but these two are actually ports of console games, not arcade titles, meaning that there hasn't truly been an arcade compilation since the Nintendo Switch release on July 28th, 2017. I'd say we need another, but honestly, I do think the series has done all that it can do. The original set has all of the history you need, Virtual Arcade is there for the largest variety, and either version of the Wii variant can fill in for the most original content. Namco Museum has fallen into dormancy, and maybe that's not such a bad thing. The last piece I will mention in this section isn't necessarily regarding Namco Museum itself, but actually predates it by a few months. In 1995, Namco would release an arcade game known as the Namco Classic Collection, with a second volume releasing the following year. Each game would include 3 Namco Classics, alongside a 90s refresh arrangement version. Wait, arrangement? Yeah, for some reason, Battle Collection would go on to use the arrangement branding even though the games already were arranged a decade prior. I suppose they either forgot or wanted the 2000s versions to replace these, as the only one of the original set to get a port since Battle Collection's release would be Pac-Man arrangement for 2022's Pac-Man Museum Plus. Half of them have never been ported at all, which is a choice. However, I'll actually argue that the original arrangement set is far superior to the PSP set, both graphically and in gameplay. Xevious arrangement is the most similar to its counterpart, while all of the others add a plethora of new mechanics, have definite endpoints, and 2-player co-op to boot. With the exception of Rally X, you get to work together with and compete against a second player through each stage, and I can only imagine how fulfilling that experience is. The Namco Classic Collection may have been forgotten in the eyes of most, but it will always remain a worthy part of the Namco timeline. Namco, as a distinct entity, may have closed in 2006, yet its branding continues to be used and celebrated for the impact it had on the arcade industry. Perhaps I have showcased exactly why that is today, as there is so much more to appreciate than just Pac-Man or Galaga. In fact, nowadays, the only games that really get brought up are those 2 games and the original Dig Dug, and while these 3 are certainly arcade legends, it leaves so many more fantastic releases to be disregarded. Namco's most intricate games are out there, so long as you look out for them, and find a satisfactory ROM for your multiple arcade machine emulator. There are countless games which even I have neglected to mention, and if there's one that particularly tickles your fancy, feel free to let this gentleman know using the comments. Collectively, I shall give Namco's library a 10 out of 13 score, which, considering the raw number of games they have made, is quite impressive. Arcades have taken on a significantly different form since then, but even as recently as this very summer, I have spotted a re-release of Namco's output, and it's actually being used as a charity machine. Fantastic! This has been quite the fitting start to my second year, and with no further commentary, I ask once more for all of you to enjoy yourselves. Well, how about that? What a wonderful way to kick off the second year! Isn't that right, Mooks?
Okay.
Wow. Alright, not a very enthusiastic response. Fine, I suppose I shall just redirect to my high score in Motos.